Good evening. How's everyone doing? Awesome. Welcome. My name is Nicholas Brown Caceres. I'm the chief of the library's music division, and I'm so happy that you're all here for this wonderful lecture series and for the latest edition. Tonight's presentation is part of the lecture series that the library has had with the American Musicological Society for 20 years now, which is pretty remarkable, and it's been a great platform for showcasing some of the finest research that's taken place in our collections over the years from a host of scholars of different backgrounds and different institutional settings and independent scholars and such. And it's really helped elevate some really fascinating aspects to our collections that might not have been as recognized and widely known in the past. So officially this series aims to highlight meaningful scholarship that American Musicological Society members have produced in researching the library's unique and unparalleled music collections. And tonight we turn to the remarkable composer, pianist, and path-breaking musician, Amy Beach. And I'm happy to say that this event is one of many that we have in commemoration of the 250th celebration of the United States. It's such an important figure in our musical history, such as Amy Beach. We are recording tonight's program, and in the coming months it will be available online through the library's website and YouTube channel, along with the previous lectures that are available on those platforms. For those of you here in person, I'd like to point out that we have a wonderful display of relevant materials in the back of the room, and thank you to Paul and everyone who has supported that effort. Make sure you check those out before you leave if you haven't seen them already. And one of the best parts of all of this is that we hope that your interest is piqued enough to come back to the reading room down on the first floor to use the collections or to access our collections online and connect with our reference staff through Ask a Librarian. And one last plug is that we do have some of the library's past publications out at the desk, special limited edition. If you're into Elliott Carter, it's your day because there's some more copies out front. And we hope that that will be of interest. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Allen Sommerfeld, who's one of our senior music reference specialists who will introduce our speaker. And Paul is also the guru behind coordinating this effort with the American Musicological Society, so we appreciate his efforts very much. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Nick. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Douglas Bomberger is a professor at Elizabethtown College Emeritus, where he has taught music history and piano. A scholar of 19th century American music, he has published 7 books and numerous articles. His research has focused primarily on transatlantic topics, including European stylistic influences on American composers in the Romantic era. He edited the Cambridge Companion to Amy Beach, published in 2023, and authored Making Music American, 1917 and the Transformation of Culture, published in 2018 by Oxford, as well as MacDowell, a biography published by Oxford in 2013. He earned his PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park, so he is a homegrown scholar, beginning a long and fruitful association with the Library of Congress. He is the immediate past president of the Society for American Music. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bomberger.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be able to be here and to participate in this series. I've admired many of the past talks, and to be part of it is a real honor. I'm also very, very grateful to Paul for all the work he's done in putting together the collection back there and also making so many materials available for us online. If you haven't had a chance, be sure and check out his research guide to Amy Beach, which you can find on the library's webpage. So, Amy Beach. If you're the kind of person who listens to WRTI or WETA, you have probably heard her music in recent years. She's really enjoying a moment, and this is a time when her music has really coming into its own. And so I fell in love with Amy Beach's music in the early 1980s as a pianist, hearing her music performed, and that was my entree. But I have spent many years studying her biography as well, and there are lots of interesting aspects about it. She is the holder of a lot of firsts. She was the person who was the first female American composer to have a symphony performed by a major orchestra in the United States. We'll hear about that in a moment. She was also the first to write a major mass for orchestra chorus, and soloists. So a lot of firsts, and someone who is significant in that way. Really the earliest American female composer of an international reputation in her own time. So today the question that I'm going to look at is one of agency, how she managed to do what she did. She truly was a pathbreaker, and the question that I set out to answer was, how did she do it? So it goes without saying, I hope, that she started life with a remarkable and prodigious talent. She also had the work ethic and the discipline to develop that talent into something really world class. But as I say, that almost goes without saying. In terms of making a professional career in a time when no one had done it before, what brought her to the front, I think, is two qualities that I see throughout her life. Number one, the courage to challenge norms and to say, even though it hasn't been done that way before, I'm going to try. And also the ability to use social connections to really help advance her career. And if that sounds a little opportunistic, I hope you will come to know that Amy was actually a thoroughly lovable person and not as self-serving as it might sound. So, a little bit of background, first of all. This is the home that she grew up in her first 7 years in New Hampshire. She was born there in 1867, and as you can see from this picture, this is a typical New Hampshire farmstead. On the right is the farmhouse, which is still standing today. On the left is the barn, and in between is a low passageway that allows the farmer to go out and feed the animals without having to slog through the waist-deep snow. So it truly is made for the New England winters. She and her family moved to Boston at the age of 7, and there she had the opportunity to develop her talent and to study with a series of German teachers. By the way, the evidence for her early prodigious accomplishments are preserved in a document by her mother in the manuscript division. And in it, her mother says that at the age of 1, she had a repertoire of 40 songs, that her perfect pitch was so acute that if her mother accidentally sang it in the wrong key, it would make Amy cry. And so other little nuggets of information like that give us a sense, but we're trusting her mother to give us an honest account of that. Her parents also believed that it would be unwise to put her on the stage like a performing monkey too early. So even though she was doing remarkable things at home, they said, let's wait to bring you before the public. That finally happened when she was age 16. And this was an event that was very, very important to her. She said, when I was 16, I was allowed to make my debut in Boston. Life was beginning. Life was beginning. What a statement. She was not the only one who thought this was a big event in Boston's life. Here's what the critic for the Boston Transcript had to say. She is plainly a pianist to the manner born and bred. Her technique is facile, even, and brilliant. Her use of the pedal exceptionally good, but fine as her technical qualifications are, it is the correctness and precocity of her musical understanding that must, in the end, most excite admiration. The ineffable charm of her playing is that perfect youthful freshness, directness, and simplicity of sentiment which belongs to her age, but which one very rarely finds so utterly free from the little awkwardnesses which are also wont to characterize immaturity. So she came before the public basically a fully formed artist. A year and a half later, she had the opportunity to debut with an orchestra. And this was not just any orchestra, it was the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which was, of course, her hometown orchestra. You can see what kind of a male-dominated atmosphere she's stepping into. So all of the members of the orchestra are men. The conductor, as was typical of this time, was a European, Arthur Nikisch, and then looming over the back of the stage is a gigantic, more than twice life-size statue of Beethoven. So this was where she first performed with an orchestra. Now, a month later, she had an opportunity to perform with another orchestra, and this was the orchestra conducted by Theodore Thomas. Theodore Thomas was America's most renowned conductor at this time. He had a traveling orchestra based in New York, and he was passing through Boston and gave her the opportunity to play the solo part of the Mendelssohn Concerto. The Mendelssohn Concerto is a piece that is not the most difficult concerto in the repertoire, but the last movement is notoriously fast and fingery. And so when he came to the last movement, in deference to her age, he took it a little bit under tempo. And here's the way she remembered what happened next. She said, "I did not know that he was sparing me, but I did know that the tempo dragged, and I swung the orchestra into time." Just because he was the most famous conductor in the country didn't mean that she was going to follow his tempo if it was wrong. So she was really poised on the brink of a major career as a performer, and she could have followed in the footsteps of several other models and traveled the country and probably the world playing the music of others for the rest of her career. But things took a different turn later that year. And so shortly after she turned 18, she got married. And she married a man who was more than twice her age. Dr. H.H.A. Beach was 42 and a widower at the time that they were married. And he was someone who had a very prominent position in Boston society. He was a surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. He was also a member of the faculty at Harvard University, where he taught surgery. And so a very, very important person. Everybody knew H.H.A. Beach, and so she took his name. And for the rest of her professional career, she called herself Mrs. H.H.A. Beach. He had certain ideas about her career, and even though he wasn't a musician himself, he guided her in the direction that he felt would be best for her to go. So for one thing, he really didn't want her traveling out of town any more than necessary. So he let her do one recital every year, and that was the limit for her solo recitals. But he was happy to have her doing charity events for the hospital and other charitable organizations, and also he didn't mind if she played with local orchestras or local chamber groups. So she didn't perform just once a year, but her solo recitals were limited to one very, very anticipated recital every year. He had other ideas about what could happen with her career. And as a matter of fact, he wanted her to be a composer. Now here's where it really gets interesting, because when he met her and when they got married, the extent of her compositions was a handful of songs for voice and piano, about 3 minutes or less each. And so this was not something that she had much experience with. She hadn't had composition lessons, and as a matter of fact, he said that it would be best if she didn't have composition lessons. He didn't want her talent to be spoiled by someone else telling her what to do. So there she went, and that was his very strong suggestion. Now, she later remembered how she felt about this. And remember, she was 18 and he was 42. And so she said, "I was fearful that I had not the skill to carry it on, but his constant assurance that I could do the work and keen criticism whenever it seemed to be weak in spots gave me the courage to go on." So that was their relationship. So how unusual was this? There were several models for successful performers, particularly Teresa Carreño was a Venezuelan pianist who had toured the country with great success, and Fanny Bloomfield Zeisler also was another European pianist who was very successful at this time, but there were no major female composers in America to look up to, and the prospects were not particularly encouraging. This book by George P. Upton was published in 1880, 5 years before Amy and Henry were married. And in it, Upton explained the situation of women in music at great length. And he allowed that there were many men who had been women who had been successful as performers. But he said at this point, probably because of their domestic duties and their inferior intellectual capabilities, women had not yet done any compositions worthwhile. So his feeling was that the prospects were fairly dim. So this was a book that sold a lot of copies, and a lot of people were reading it and taking him at his word. So the Beaches were really forging a path that was completely different, and they were saying, we're going to politely disagree with Mr. Upton. So Dr. Beach had the good sense to give her the time and tools to be creative. And this is a contemporary drawing of her music room. I'm sorry it's a little dark, but hopefully you can see that there is a grand piano on the right and a comfortable fireplace on the left, chairs, shelves for her books and music, and it has a bay window overlooking Commonwealth Avenue, so the most exclusive street in the back bay of Boston at this time. He urged her not just to continue writing songs, but to aim high and to compose big works. And in fact, her first major work was a Mass in E-flat major. Think about this for just a moment. This is a teenager who is setting out to compose something that is one of the larger works of the European canon. And so this was a very ambitious project. She composed it in 1886 to 87. It was completed in 1889, published in 1890, thanks to Arthur P. Schmidt, and then reviewed in the press in 1891 and finally premiered in 1892. By the time it was heard, she really was gathering a reputation, and the idea that a woman could compose a piece of this scope and scale was really a new thought. This led to a commission that same year from the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This was the largest of the international expositions in the United States. It attracted over 27 million visitors that summer of 1893. She was commissioned to write a welcome piece for the dedication of the Women's Building. So turning back to the music room on Commonwealth Avenue, I have a brief list of some of her most important works during this time period. And as you can see, she wrote the Grand Mass, she wrote a symphony, a violin sonata, a series of songs on major European poets, Shakespeare and Browning, a piano concerto, and on and on. These were serious intellectual works, and she was someone who really did not shy away from the heavier aspects of serious composition. At the same time, though, she couldn't completely give up on songs. And so here are two covers of songs that she wrote as well. And these wound up being immensely popular with amateur singers, and they were designed to be within the reach of the typical singer at home. So I'd like you to hear the one on the left, and this is, the one on the right, The Years at the Spring. This is to a text by Robert Browning, and it was a very popular song. In 1932, over 3 decades after it was published, it was still voted the most popular song among the National Federation of Music Clubs, so one that had quite a shelf life. So let's listen to this short 1-minute song.
The years at the spring, and days in the morn, mornings at 7, the hillsides do pour. The years at the spring, and days in the morn, the larks on the wing, the snails on the thorn,
squinting carefully at the bottom of these sheets, you notice that the Mass and both of these pieces were published by the same publisher, Arthur P. Schmidt. We're very fortunate that the Library of Congress holds a massive collection of business papers, manuscripts, and correspondence and other things from the Schmidt Company, over 500 cartons. And so it's a remarkable resource to be able to go through this and look for clues to her life and her musical development. Among the most interesting things are the scores, and these were scores that were written by hand and then used as engraving copies by the publisher. And so here, for instance, we have an example of a song from Opus 1, the Ariette. And this is still fairly immature in the manuscript handwriting of hers. And you can see, if you look closely, that there are blue markings designating the line breaks that the engraver is going to use. So there is a wealth of information to be gleaned from these manuscripts, and you can learn about one of them and some pastovers if you'll look at the screen back there and see the benefits of infrared photography. One of the things that's most interesting to me is the correspondence that Beach wrote back and forth to Schmidt. And I'd like to read a couple of letters to you just to give you a sense of some of the things that we can learn from these. So here, for instance, is a letter from Beach to Schmidt from 1902. My dear sir, with this I return corrected proof of the Italian and English song. It will be necessary for me to see one more in order to be sure that all the faults are corrected. So this is an important clue to her working method. For most young composers, they send in the manuscript, and this goes for also people who write words like articles and books. You send in the manuscript, the publisher sets it in print, and then sends you back a proof for correcting on an impossibly short timeline. And you have to quickly see if you can find anything wrong and send it back. But what Amy's saying here is that I want my usual privilege of having another proof. So she gets multiple proofs to make sure that it is really exactly the way she wants it. So that is a very helpful thing for a young composer. Another letter from 1901 shows that she was unfailingly grateful to Schmidt for the things he was doing for her. My dear sir, many thanks for the copies of Summer Dreams duly received. I must say again how delighted I am with the appearance of the work. In every respect it meets my wishes most fully, and I am sure that no one could fail to appreciate the daintiness of coloring and printing. So she really did not hesitate to thank him when he did something nice for her. A copy of that manuscript, or the published version, is back on the table. Finally then, Henry also was an active correspondent with Arthur, and part of the reason is that the publisher was one of his patients as a medical doctor, and so they talk about things like hay fever and sore backs and things like that. But Henry also has ideas about how Schmidt should promote Amy's career. In 1905 he says, "My dear Mr. Schmidt, in considering carefully the best interests of all concerned, it seems wise, as in the case of the sea pieces, to place the work before a fairly friendly audience first. There has been a large amount of what may be regarded as the kind of commendation that helps to keep a musical work alive." So he's actively working with Schmidt to get the best possible placement for her pieces. So, in summary, Schmidt really plays a crucial role in her early career. Number one, he's creating accurate and attractive scores. Number two, he's making sure that she gets good reviews and advocacy in the press. And number three, then, he's promoting her work through brochures and other promotional materials. Here is a book that was published in 1906. It's a pamphlet that really runs to over 100 pages long, and it has a biography of her, a list of her works, multiple reviews, and so it was a promotional piece that she handed out for years to come. So before we turn to the next stage of her life, I want to think for a moment about her position in Boston society. Boston was notoriously patriarchal. And neither Henry nor Amy had been born into the upper echelon of the Brahmins, of the wealthy elite in Boston. But they were accepted in the parlors of these people because of her artistry and because of his usefulness as a doctor. And so they moved in those circles even though they didn't technically belong to those circles. At the same time, Amy was also respected and collaborated with the musicians of Boston, the working people who actually created the music that people listened to. And this group of people, for instance, was a frequent collaborator. The Kneisel Quartet consisted of 4 players from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and they were so successful as a quartet that they eventually left the orchestra and toured exclusively as a chamber group. The piece that I'm about to play for you is the 3rd movement of her piano quintet, Opus 67. This is one of her most erudite and serious works, and as you can hear in this movement, it's also highly virtuosic. This next image shows what we probably should have expected. Since she married someone who was so much older than she was, he died quite a bit earlier than she would have hoped. He died, unfortunately, through a freak accident. He was paying a house call on a patient late at night. He tripped and fell down a staircase and injured himself. At first, they thought he was going to recover, but then he did die. So he was 67. She was 42 at this point, and was thoroughly ensconced in Boston society. She had the respect of all the local musicians, and so at that point, she could easily have settled down to a quiet life as a widow in Boston and lived out the rest of her many, many years. But she had another idea. And so she decided to do something bold and very different from what people expected her to do. She packed up the house and she left for Europe. She had the help of a friend, Marcella Kraft. Marcella Kraft had come to Boston as a music student, as a vocal student at the New England Conservatory in the 1890s, and there she was befriended by Henry and Amy. She, by this time, was a leading singer in the Bavarian State Opera in Munich, and so the two of them went to Munich together. By the way, this is a picture of her in one of her lighter roles, but her most famous role was in Salome by Richard Strauss. She created the role for the first production of that really influential opera. Finally, here they are sitting in Munich enjoying a cup of tea. And again, this is maybe a little bit more what Arthur P. Schmidt had in mind, that a good vacation would be a way for her to recover from the loss of her husband so unexpectedly. But for her, she had a different idea. She saw this as a career move. And so she really wanted to move ahead with making connections in Europe so that she could use it as a springboard for a subsequent American career. So this is where the Schmidt collection again becomes very useful, because we can dig into the correspondence not only between Amy and Arthur, which are very formal, but also his correspondence to his European agent in Leipzig. And he has sometimes a very different story to tell to the European agent than he does to her. And so we get a sense early on of the kind of conflict that they were going to run into. So she really wanted to continue doing the kinds of things that had been so helpful to her career in Boston. She wanted to, number one, give free copies of her music to professionals who might be induced to perform it. And she also wanted to make sure that there were lots of copies of her music available in the music shop so that people could go in and browse and look at it. He had a very different idea, and this letter from 1912 gives us a sense of what he was thinking. He said, "Music has been forwarded to Signor Scambati and Signora Giorni. If Mr. Scambati desires to interest himself in your compositions, he may feel assured that copies of the same can be promptly furnished. For a number of years, we have had stocks of American compositions in Vienna, Dresden, Berlin, and Paris, and the success has been very discouraging indeed." So what he's telling her is, I've tried to sell American music to Europeans, and they're not interested. What she's saying is, I'm here. I'm going to play concerts. I want people to be able to go and look through my music the morning after I perform. So they went back and forth for the better part of the year about this dilemma. And she finally then laid out her thoughts in an extensive letter on October 5th, which is also on the table at the back. Here is part of that letter. "I did not expect anyone to procure copies of my music from them save by purchase. It seems to me very important to take advantage of the interest shown in my work and to have some firm in Europe to whom I can refer people who wish to order my compositions. If you can keep the Schott Company supplied with a good variety of my work, it will be good for me and for you also. The Munich firm of Alfred Schmidt Nachfolger have shown much willingness to sell my music, ordering it from the Schott Company. Mrs. Hensel, the head of the present firm, is my concert manager at present and has already arranged appearances for me in Dresden, Leipzig, and Munich, at which I shall introduce my violin sonata and some of my songs. I have been asked to play my quintet with the Münchner Quartet in January in their regular series. I feel that there will be quite all the opportunities for me that I can handle if I can only be reinforced by you in the matter of a continuous supply of my compositions in some place more available than America. It takes so long to obtain copies of the songs, etc., from Boston, and people become impatient." So that was the stalemate that they were in. But meanwhile, she had forged ahead with setting up some concerts. And as you can see, she was scheduled to play in Dresden, Leipzig, Munich twice, and in Breslau. All of those then were chamber concerts at which she played music like the violin sonata or the quintet, and also songs. And so those were of a smaller scale. But it was the way to get started. She wrote to Schmidt and reported on how it was going. She said, "My recent concert here was a brilliant success. The audience was large and very enthusiastic, and there were quite as many Germans as Americans present. I was gratified also at the unexpectedly large sale of tickets, which paid the larger part of my expenses, and these were rather heavy, owing to the high character of my associates." So she was really trying to present herself in the best possible light by hiring very good musicians and by taking a financial loss. As soon as she got reviews in the paper, she sent them to America, and these then were translated and made their way into papers like Musical America, Musical Courier, and others like that. She really was very savvy about promoting herself and not letting an opportunity slip. When we look closely at those at the reviews rather, we see that they were a little bit mixed the first season. And part of the reason was that the Germans wanted to be able to pigeonhole her and decide what she was. And so is she a performer or is she a composer? Make up your mind. Is she a serious composer or is she a light composer of entertainment music? And they didn't like the discrepancies that they heard in her music, so it took them a little while to get used to that. She went on to say to Schmidt a little bit more about her plans for the future. She said, "I am not trying to play in a large number of concerts this season, as it is fatiguing with the necessary traveling, etc., and I am not yet very strong, as the new life is hard and exhausting to me in many ways, as you can understand. but I shall try to make each appearance a benefit to my work in future American tours if I can carry out my present plan of making some of these in coming years. Even a limited number of European appearances will help at home, as you know. So with Schmidt of only marginal help, it was time for her to make some new friends. And she turned out to be very good at that, as always. One of the first friends that she made contact with was a man by the name of Theodor Spiering. He had been born in St. Louis, and he studied violin in Berlin. Apparently he was a very good violinist because he was later appointed the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic while Mahler was there. During the year that Amy Beach was in Europe, he was the guest conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, and so he had concerts that he needed to fill with music. And to his credit, he was very happy to consider works by his American compatriots. Another person who was very helpful to her was Arthur Abel. Abel was a colorful character who was a fixture in Berlin society. He loved to throw parties, and whenever Beach came to town, he would throw a party and invite all the people who counted and bring them in to meet her. He also was the Berlin correspondent for the Musical Courier, and so he regularly mentioned her activities in his columns. So he set things up for her in terms of the publicity, and Spiering then went ahead and scheduled her for 3 of his concerts in Leipzig, Hamburg, and Dresden in the fall of Berlin in the fall of 1913. So on all 3 of these, she played her piano concerto, and then on 2 of them, he included the Gaelic Symphony as well. So for those 2 concerts in Leipzig and Hamburg, it was almost an all-Beach evening. Not quite, but almost. The circumstances surrounding the Hamburg concert especially are very interesting and well documented. And the reason is because she wrote about exactly what happened that evening. She said, "I was summarily warned of the fate that probably awaited me when my Gaelic Symphony and my piano concerto were played in Hamburg. The audience would be cold, the critics hostile. At best, I could anticipate nothing better than a show of politeness. The symphony was splendidly played, but had only a courteous reception. Immediately thereafter, I was to play the piano part of my concerto, but I rejected the invitation to discouragement, got my mad up, as we say in New England, and determined to force the audience to like it." So I want to give you a visual image before, or a mental picture rather, before you hear the opening of the first movement. We've got again, an all-male orchestra. We've got a skeptical German audience, and we've got a 5-foot-tall pianist who has very large and powerful hands. Let's see what this is going to sound like. Diminished chord hanging. So not only did the audience like it, but so did the critics. And this is the judgment of one of the most influential of the Hamburg critics, Ferdinand Voll. He said, "Strong creative power, glowing fancy, instinct for form and color are united in her work with facile and effortless mastery of the entire technical apparatus. To this is added charm of poetic mood, delicacy and grace of melody, and a gift for rich, soulful harmonization." Wow. So you can bet that almost immediately she sent off this and other reviews to America. They were translated and published in the trade journals, and so she was working hard to build her reputation from across the ocean. She also wisely took the step of finding a new publisher. Although she had had a 25-year exclusive relationship with Schmidt, it was clear to her that maybe she needed to step back for a while and find someone else to publish her music. And so if you're familiar with those old yellow Schirmer volumes, that was the publisher that she went with next. And Schirmer was happy to publish a series of her compositions written during her time in Europe. Now, this was in early 1914, after that series of concerts in the fall of 1913, and as I'm sure you all know, things really changed in the world in 1914. That was the summer that war broke out, and the World War I changed everything. And so she stayed as long as she could, but finally in October of 1914, she caught one of the last ships back and returned to the United States. By this time, she was much more famous when she returned than she had been when she left. And she was greeted on the pier by journalists who were eager to hear her story and eager to tell her story to the world. One journalist went so far as to call her the Lion of the Hour. And she really came back ready to go with a second career. And this second career then was going to be the one that had been deferred at the age of 18, because now she had the opportunity to hire a concert manager, to hire a press agent, and to travel the country as a performer. And this she did for the next several years. So she traveled back and forth doing concerts at large venues and small in all kinds of settings. Here she is with another group of composers at the Pan-Pacific Exposition in 1915 on American Composers' Day. Earlier that summer, the city of San Diego hosted her in an Amy Beach Day, and so that was the day dedicated to her and her music. So she finally got to do the traveling and performing that she had dreamed of as a teenager. But after a few years, she discovered something odd, something that was missing in her life, and of course that was composition. She wrote on several occasions about the fact that the life of a performer and the life of a composer are completely opposite from each other, because as a composer you need total solitude, you need space, you need quiet, whereas a pianist is constantly bombarded with interviews and rehearsals and busy. And so she really missed the composing atmosphere as well. And so in the beginning of 1918, she took the opportunity to step back from touring to care for a sick relative. And while she was caring for this relative then, she began to investigate how she might find the solitude that she was missing so much to compose. And this is when she drew on another very important acquaintance, and this was Marion McDowell. So Marion McDowell, like Amy, was a widow. Marion had been married to Edward McDowell, who was the country's most famous composer in the first decade of the century. And after Edward's untimely death in 1908, she had taken their property in New Hampshire, their farm, and turned it into an artist's colony where people could come and do what they did best in solitude. So she invited composers and artists, painters, poets, and playwrights. And here then was a thriving atmosphere for Amy to compose in solitude. So just a couple of pictures, and we have with us probably the leading expert on Marion McDowell, Robin Rausch, and I'm grateful to her for her work. On the right, you see a picture of Marion in a horse-drawn carriage taking lunch to the colonists so that they wouldn't need to leave their work to walk to get their lunch. In the middle, then, there's a brochure. She spent her winters typically raising funds for the colony. And so this was what she devoted her life to after her husband's death. Now, Amy found she really loved the New Hampshire woods. And as it turns out, her first visit was in 1921. She spent almost every summer for the rest of her life in New Hampshire, where she had the opportunity to compose at leisure, and then she could spend the winters in New York with all the stimulation of going to concerts and interacting with people, but the summers were her sacred time for composing. So I'd like you to hear a piece that was written during that first summer in New Hampshire, and this is entitled The Hermit Thrush at Eve. The hermit thrush is one of the most tuneful of the North American songbirds, and the thing that I like about it so much is that it sings in thirds, and sometimes it stacks those thirds so that you actually get a triad. And so if you listen carefully, you'll hear the bird singing in triads. She transcribed the song of the bird that was outside her window, and you'll hear at the beginning of the piece a kind of an atmospheric, impressionistic opening that sets a very, very quiet mood of evening, and then the bird is going to come in very high in the right hand. In later years, Beach became active in leadership roles in a number of national organizations. And here she is with the composers group of the National League of American Pen Women. She was also active in Music Teachers National Association and also in the National Federation of Music Clubs. This last organization was an umbrella organization for thousands of clubs nationwide that were organized by piano teachers and others who were musical amateurs and interested in music. Here she is with the Amy Beach Club of Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And you can see she's surrounded by young people who presumably are learning her music. So 1942 brought a celebration in honor of her 75th birthday, and unfortunately she was too ill by this time to travel. She developed heart disease in the last years of her life. But this was held at the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C. And it was organized by Elena Desane. And as you can see, it's two very chock-full all-beach programs. So a big, big weekend of music. By the way, Madame Desane gave a collection of her materials to the library, and so this was again taken from the Library of Congress collection. So probably her most important affiliation in her last years was with St. Bartholomew's Church in New York. And St. Bart's had a long and rich musical tradition, and at the time she was there, the organist and choir director was David McKay Williams, and he was an important conductor. For instance, he made the first recording of Bach's St. Matthew Passion in 1930. So she attended the church whenever she was in town, and she wrote lots and lots of choral music that was performed by this choir. And so she was almost like a composer in residence in the church in her last decades of her life. So thinking back on all we've talked about this evening, Amy Beach was born 2 years after the Civil War ended in 1867. And she died a year before the end of World War II in 1944. She stayed active virtually that whole time, and so had a continuously active career and really forged new paths for herself and for other female composers in the future. So I'd like to play one more piece for you before we break for questions. This is a short choral piece entitled Peace I Leave With You.
We have time for questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you so everyone can hear.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. This was brilliant. I have a question about interpretation around her husband's actions and guidance into her becoming a composer. I find that really unusual for the time. And I think, I don't know, I'm sort of curious about your thoughts, if that was like a genuine wish or, or if he was sort of like just wanting her to be closer to home and limit her recital career. Because again, there weren't many models of successful female composers at the time.
You're correct, yes. I think one of the best summaries of the issues involving this are found in a chapter in Adrienne Fried Bloch's biography from 1998. And she heads the chapter, Two Views of a Marriage. And so she makes the case for both sides. On the one hand, it was kind of self-serving of Henry to say, I don't want you leaving town, I want you to be available, I want you here. On the other hand, she argues that the support that Henry gave her made it possible for Amy to have the career she did. And so she says that like most marriages, it's not one thing or the other, but it's mixed, it's some of both.
Once she got to Germany, and did she travel with that woman that she had, who was also a widow? And because it mentioned at some point in one of the newspapers that she was going to, are you capable of writing an opera for that woman?
Yes, Marcella Kraft was really a very busy singer. She, as I said, was a leading singer with the Bavarian State Opera, so she didn't have much opportunity to leave town once the season was underway. So they certainly traveled together during her breaks from the performances, and they traveled notably to Italy together. They were planning to do a concert together in Austria when they had to go back to the United States because of the outbreak of World War I. But I would say Amy was more independent than not. She was someone who was willing to forge new paths, and so Marcella certainly gave her some tips on who to meet and how to meet them, but then she took the ball and ran with it. So it definitely wasn't a situation of Marcella Kraft leading her around.
While people are thinking, I have a question.
Yeah.
So Schmidt published a lot of women composers, especially around the same time that he was publishing Amy Beach. Was his relationship with her different than those other women composers? Was she a unique case, or was that typical with how he engaged with all of the women composers he, quote unquote, championed by publishing them?
I believe he really had a special connection to her. And so there was something about his friendship with Henry that made him very, very eager to please the two of them. And so Schmidt worked harder for Amy than he did for any of the other women composers, as far as I can tell. I will say, though, that Schmidt was someone who knew where his profit lay. And so, for instance, when Edward MacDowell came back to the United States in 1888, he really did everything he could to get MacDowell into his fold and to really promote his works. I don't want to rag on Schmidt, but one of the things that I did discover in looking through the business records is that Schmidt was very good about publishing women's works, but not very good about renewing their copyrights. And so in many, many cases, he just neglected to renew the copyrights. And so that meant that after 28 years, it was in the public domain.
Building on that point, and thank you for the wonderful lecture, I'm curious to know how her compensation compared to peers. Would it go along with the trend of we would think women were not being compensated on par with men, or was she kind of more commensurate in terms of commission fees, performance fees, and then publisher royalties?
My understanding is that it was commensurate, yes. And there is a document from the files back there in which quite a bit late in her career, after her death, her estate needed to have an accurate record of her earnings. And so the Schmidt Company tallied up all of her earnings by year from, I believe, 1905 up until the 1940s. And so that gives us a really good sense of how much she was making. She really did well financially, surprisingly well.
It was curious to me that the Phillips collection did a 75th birthday celebration for her, while her roots were more in New Hampshire and Boston and New York. If you have any insight on that, I'd be interested. And also, the National Symphony was founded in 1931 by Hans Kindler, and whether there might, to your knowledge, have been any exchanges between them.
Yes, the Phillips concerts were organized by Elena Desain, and I don't know how she got interested in the music of Amy Beach, but she seems to have had a local connection there that allowed her to convince the Phillips Gallery to do that. And the documents are there in the collection, so if someone wanted to dig in and find out exactly how and why that happened, I think the information would be there. Regarding the Washington Symphony, yes, there's another letter back there about a performance of her concerto by a pianist by the name of Dagmar Rubner, who performed with the Washington Symphony, and so there was a connection there. Unfortunately, Beach couldn't get there to hear that one either, but she heard good reports about it, and it was reviewed very favorably in the Washington press.
You had mentioned that there was a differing in correspondence between Schmidt and Beach, and then Schmidt to someone else. I was curious about like the differentiation between that.
Yes, one of my favorite topics. So the deal was that Schmidt was very polite when he wrote to Amy in Europe, and he said, you know, times are tough and business is hard, and I can't do everything I could before, yada yada yada, and when he wrote to his agent in Leipzig, he said, don't give her what she's asking for. Don't send any more free copies, and make sure that if people want her music, they contact Boston. So write a letter to Boston. Don't give in to her needs. But the agent, to his credit, in Leipzig, kept on saying, we need more copies of this song, we need more copies of that piano piece. And so virtually every letter that he wrote back, he said, this is what we're running low on, can you send more of them? And so Schmidt liked nothing better than selling music, so he kept on sending them over.
Do we know about any young composers that Amy Beach mentored later on in her educational career?
Yes, it's interesting. Robin just shared with me recently a letter from, or several letters from a composer who's actually quite a bit older than Amy, but nonetheless who admired her work greatly and shared her works with her. And Amy is ever the diplomat, and she's very complimentary and shies away from giving specific advice on how to do one thing or another. But she says some intriguing things about her own compositions and her own position in the world of music. Writing in 1905, she said, you know, the case is closed now. No one anymore is saying that women can't compose. And so if she was honest, I'm sure she would say that she had a lot to do with that.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a burning question to ask.
Well, please do look at the exhibit back there. It is fabulous. And thanks again to Paul and all the others who made this happen.